There is a particular quality to the silence in Duskwood that I have never encountered anywhere else on Azeroth. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of something waiting. Travelers who pass through on the road south from Elwyn Forest often describe a vague unease settling over them before they can even name its cause. Before the twisted trees fully close in around the path, before the first wolf howls somewhere in the dark beyond the road's edge. The discomfort arrives before the evidence. The feeling precedes the explanation. Most people, if they think of Duskwood at all, think of it as a haunted wood, a grim footnote in the maps of the Eastern Kingdoms, a region of wolves and undead and perpetual twilight that exists on the southern edge of the continent, the way an old wound exists on the body, present, unpleasant, manageable to ignore. They know it is dangerous. They know the light does not reach it properly, that the sky carries a quality of shadow that has no meteorological explanation, that the dead walk there in numbers, and the wolves press inward from the tree line night after night. They accept this as though it were simply the nature of the place, as though Duskwood had always been dark and strange and abandoned, as though it had emerged from some older era already wearing its current face. But it had not. That is what the records show when you read them carefully, and that is what unsettles me most about it. Before the darkness, before the Worgen, before the dead rose and the farms went quiet, this was Brightwood. That was its name, recorded in the oldest written accounts of the region. A southern stretch of what was then simply called Elwyn Forest, it held two sizable towns, Grand Hamlet and Raven Hill, and the agricultural network that surrounded them. People planted crops here. They raised children. They built homes they intended to pass down through generations. They had names. They had histories. They had expectations about the future that were entirely reasonable, given what they knew of the world. And then the world moved, and the history that erased them barely paused to record that they had been erased. That is the question this chronicle is built around. Not the darkness itself, not the wolves, or the undead, or the permanent twilight. Those are the symptoms. The question is what the darkness replaced, and what it tells us about the manner in which tragedy accumulates in forgotten places. What happens when a region and its people are abandoned, not once in a single recognized catastrophe, but in a series of catastrophes that arrived one after another, each one finding the ground already softened by the last. My name is Aldrich. I have spent more years than I care to count in service to the preservation of records, first among the Kirin Tor in Dalaran, where I learned the discipline of careful documentation, and later in the field with the Explorers League, where the records I preserved were more often carved into stone by civilizations long dead than written in ink by living hands. I have seen what is left when histories are not kept. The silences in the archaeological record, the gaps in the archive, the way an absence of documentation becomes its own kind of evidence. Duskwood is one of those places, and I have walked its roads. I know what the silence there feels like from the inside. To understand Duskwood as it became, it is necessary first to understand what Brightwood was, as a living, working part of a civilization at the height of Stormwind's power. The kingdom that ruled from the great capital city had grown over several generations, from one of the fractious human tribes that competed for territory in the centuries following the Troll Wars into the dominant power of the continent's southern half. Its sphere of influence extended far beyond the capital's walls, organizing farmlands and settlements across Elwyn and beyond into something that functioned, for most people most of the time, as a comprehensible world. Brightwood and its surrounding territory were part of this world in the most unremarkable possible way. The records are explicit that Stormwind found much of its prosperity through the farmsteads that dotted the surrounding fertile regions, and as its population grew, small towns sprang up in the nearby areas, notably here in what the older maps call Southern Elwyn. Grand Hamlet and Raven Hill were among those towns. No great academies were located there. No legendary heroes were born there in numbers sufficient to make it notable. No battles of particular strategic significance were fought on its soil before the catastrophe arrived. It was the kind of territory that a stable civilization accumulates around itself almost automatically. The steady accretion of ordinary lives, building an ordinary community that expected with reasonable confidence to persist. What we know of those communities comes from indirect sources: trade records, land surveys, the occasional personal letter preserved by chance in some larger archive. But those fragments are enough to establish the basic fact. These were real places inhabited by real people who had real expectations of continuity. Their concerns would have been immediate and particular: this harvest, this drought, this marriage, this debt. The First War ended that continuity. When the Orcish horde emerged from the Dark Portal, Stormwind's southern territories were among the first to absorb the impact. The war chief Blackhand ordered raiding parties to cut deep into Stormwind's lands, driving the human populace to panic. Entire villages in Westfall fell to the old horde's control, their inhabitants killed or forced to flee. The accounts that survive from this period describe a progressive compression of the surviving population toward the capital, a shrinking defensive perimeter as community after community was overwhelmed or abandoned. Stormwind fell. The king was slain. The survivors were evacuated by the fleet led by Anduin Lothar to the shores of Lordaeron, there to beg the assistance of the other human kingdoms and prepare for the wider conflict that would become the Second War. That evacuation is remembered, and rightly, as an act of extraordinary survival. It preserved the core of Stormwind's people and its military capacity. It enabled the formation of the Alliance of Lordaeron. But evacuations have a quality that military histories consistently fail to capture honestly. They are selective. The arithmetic of emergency does not accommodate everyone equally. The people who board the ships are the people who were close enough to the departure points, informed enough to know the ships were coming, mobile enough to reach them in time, and fortunate enough that nothing intervened. The settlements in Brightwood's interior were left behind. What happened in those communities in the final period of the First War is recorded only in fragments. Some settlements were destroyed outright during the Horde's advance. Others were emptied as people fled by whatever means they had. Some communities may have persisted in relative isolation, cut off from the larger war, surviving in ways that generated no official documentation, because no official apparatus was present to document them. When the Second War ended and the Alliance was victorious, when Stormwind was rebuilt and the Horde defeated, the abandoned southern territories arose as a question to be answered. The capital was rebuilt. The essential infrastructure of the kingdom was restored, and the territories with political weight and strategic importance received attention. The places like Brightwood, Peripheral, and Emptied were noted and quietly left for later. Later became permanent. The people who had evacuated did not return in meaningful numbers, because returning meant coming back to places that held grief and ruin and no promise of the material support that rebuilding required. Roads needed clearing, structures needed repair or replacement. Farmland that had been fallow for years needed breaking again from the undergrowth that had claimed it. These were not impossible tasks, but they required investment, organized, sustained, and backed by whatever authority was prepared to make it available. That authority was occupied with other things. The settled understanding in Stormwind's administrative circles seems to have been that Brightwood would reconstitute itself in time, the way territories sometimes do if left to their own momentum. It did not. The settlements that had somehow persisted through the war were too small and too isolated to pull others back. Without the critical mass that makes resettlement self-sustaining, the movement never achieved momentum. The land went fallow, the forest thickened, and then Medivh died. The darkness that permanently settled over Duskwood has a specific origin, and it is not metaphorical. The death of Medivh, the last guardian of Tirisfal, slain at Karazhan by Anduin Lothar and his young apprentice Khadgar during the First War, unleashed a catastrophic release of Fel energy into the surrounding land. The Tower of Karazhan sits in Deadwind Pass, just east of what was Brightwood, and the records are consistent on this point. From that day forward, a terrible curse spread from Karazhan through the surrounding territories, casting a permanent dark pall over Deadwind Pass and the forest to the west. The black fog that hangs over the region, the gnarled transformation of what were once simply trees, the sky that carries its quality of permanent shadow regardless of season or weather, all of it traces to that single event. Brightwood became Duskwood, and the name was earned. There is something worth sitting with in that origin. Medivh's death did not come from nowhere. Medivh had been corrupted by Sargeras since before his birth, possessed, in a sense, by a force far older and more powerful than any individual mage could contain. His betrayal of humanity, his role in opening the dark portal that allowed the Horde to enter Azeroth, his long and terrible service to forces that were destroying the world. All of this was the consequence of that possession. And when Lothar and Khadgar ended it, the Fel energy that had been accumulating within him and within Karazhan for decades was released all at once. Brightwood did not choose to be in the path of that release. It did not earn what came to it. It was simply in the wrong proximity to a catastrophe it had no part in creating, at a moment when it had already lost most of its capacity to survive such a thing. The Horde had cleared the population. The evacuation had removed the survivors. What remained in the southern forest when the darkness came was a community already reduced to its most fragile remnant, and what arrived was something the full might of Stormwind itself could not have prevented. The darkness, then, was not the final disaster. It was the disaster that fell into the space the earlier disasters had prepared. The undead that walk Duskwood add another layer to this account, and they require a specific name: Morbent Fel. He was a human necromancer who took up residence in the Forlorn Row section of Ravenhill Cemetery, an independent practitioner not affiliated with the Scourge, raising and commanding the dead through his own arts. The graves of Ravenhill, which hold the dead of the region from the First War, from the years of darkness, from the slow accumulation of loss across several generations, became his resource. His power over the undead was extensive enough that the Night Watch considered him one of the primary threats to Darkshire's survival, and the Torch of Holy Flame, an artifact that suppressed his enchantments and kept the cemetery's dead docile, was eventually placed outside his house specifically to counteract his influence. That the undead of Ravenhill are his creation rather than Scourge remnants is a distinction that matters. It means a specific person with specific ambitions chose to make tools of the dead that the region had already been failed in life. The Dark Riders from Deadwind Pass, mysterious cloaked figures serving forces connected to Karazhan itself, also moved through the region, connected to the artifacts and powers that radiated from the dead mage's tower. Morbent Fel was known to deal with them. The corruption that emanated from Karazhan was not static. It generated threats of its own, in addition to the environmental darkness, and it drew to Duskwood the attention of forces that had no interest in the living community there except as obstacles. All of this sat on top of the original abandoned civilization, the abandoned farmsteads, the dark sky, the graves of people who had lived real lives in this place, now being put to use by a necromancer. The darkness of Duskwood is not a single curse. It is several catastrophes, layered in sequence, each one finding the region less capable of absorbing it than the last. The Scythe of Elune arrived in Duskwood separately, and its story belongs to a different chain of events entirely, one that intersects with the region's history rather than defining it. The Scythe itself is ancient. It predates Stormwind, predates the human kingdoms, predates most of the recorded history of the Eastern kingdoms in any form. In the traditions of the Night Elves, it was connected to the goddess Elune and to the Worgen, beings who occupy a peculiar position in the cosmology of Azeroth, tied to the wolf ancient Goldrin and to the Emerald Dream, and whose history stretches back to a war between Night Elf druids and the Satyr. Certain druids in that conflict had taken the form of the wolf and proved unable to return from it. The great archdruid Malfurion Stormrage eventually banished those transformed druids, the first Worgen, beneath Darrell Near within the Emerald Dream, where they would sleep for centuries. The scythe was then entrusted to Melthandris and hidden away, forgotten for thousands of years. The mage Ur, a researcher, by the available accounts, who was studying these creatures and their nature, compiled what he knew into a text. He is notable for a specific restraint. He studied the Worgen carefully, documented their nature and the mechanisms by which they might theoretically be called, and then stopped. He named them Worgen. He wrote the Book of Ur, and he declined to experiment further, Whether that restraint came from wisdom or from some other calculation, the accounts do not say. What they establish is that accumulated knowledge about a dangerous force without attempting to use it, which is precisely the kind of scholarship that depends, for its safety, on remaining purely academic. What happened to that scholarship is a story of desperation in wartime. Archmage Arugal was originally a patriot and royal archmage of Gilneas, who later joined the Kirin Tor of Dalaran. When the Scourge destroyed Dalaran, he returned to Gilneas. As the undead tide threatened even the Greymane Wall, the great barrier Gen Greymane had built, isolating Gilneas from the rest of the world, the king called on Arugal to find something capable of stopping what conventional arms could not. Arugal found Ur's research. He warned Greymane of the risks. Greymane insisted, and so, with the blessings of the king and against the explicit advice of his Kirin Tor peers, Arugal summoned the Worgen. They worked. The Worgen destroyed Scourge forces at the Greymane Wall with a ferocity that nothing else had matched. And then they turned. The Worgen attacked the Gilnean military. They spread through Silverpine Forest. Baron Silverlane's keep was overrun. Arugal, broken by guilt and no longer capable of coherent response, retreated into what he renamed Shadowfang Keep and declared the Worgen his children. His madness was not performance. It was the collapse of a man who had done precisely what he was warned not to do, and then watched the consequences devour the people around him. What followed was a spread of the Worgen curse southward through Silverpine and eventually into Duskwood. This is the point at which Velinde Starsong, a night elf priestess and sentinel, enters the account. After the Third War, she was sent to cleanse demons from Ashenvale. She found the Scythe of Elune at the shrine of Melthandris and used it to summon Worgen to fight the demons. But the Scythe's power eventually began operating independently of her will, summoning Worgen without her direction, the numbers growing in ways she could not account for. She heard that Arugal had also summoned Worgen and traveled to the eastern kingdoms, seeking him out, hoping he could provide some insight or assistance. She never reached him. In Duskwood, she was intercepted at Roland's Doom, a mine in the western reaches of the forest, by a Worgen named Varkas, who coveted the scythe. She fell in the fight, a torch she was carrying igniting some dynamite in the mine, collapsing it around her. The scythe was lost there. Her ghost remains near that place to this day, an echo of a journey that ended before it could accomplish its purpose. The scythe was later recovered by a frightened man named Jitters, a member of a team who had entered Roland's Doom, looking for the source of its darkness. Jitters picked up the weapon, triggering its summoning effect, and the mine was immediately filled with Worgen. He escaped with the scythe, lost it in the woods, and hid in the barn of the Jorgen farmstead, where the Dark Riders from Deadwind Pass arrived looking for the artifact and slaughtered Sven Jorgen's family in front of his eyes. The scythe changed hands several more times across the years, eventually making its way to the Night Elves of Gilneas, where it played a central role in the events of the Fourth War. Its passage through Duskwood left marks that outlasted even those later events. The scythe's presence in Roland's Doom, combined with what was already in the land, the Worgen from Arugal's summoning spreading south, the fell darkness from Karazhan's proximity, created in Duskwood the particular horror it has become. The Worgen are not a single type. The Nightbane pack, which inhabits the forest's deeper reaches, represents a population connected to the older history of the curse, to the Emerald Dream, to Goldrin, to a lineage that predates Arugal entirely. They are distinct from the Worgen, whose origins trace more directly to the spreading curse of Silverpine. Both are present in Duskwood, layered on top of each other and on top of everything else that had already accumulated there. What strikes me in reading these accounts again and again is how the specific vulnerability of Duskwood amplified each of these crises. A populated, functioning territory has assets that an abandoned one does not. It has social infrastructure, the networks of communication that let one settlement warn another, the community leadership that can organize a collective response. It has, in the simplest terms, people in sufficient numbers and social organization to mount a resistance. Duskwood had almost none of these things in any meaningful measure by the time the Worgen curse reached it. The farmsteads were already empty. The villages were reduced to shadows of their former populations. The Night Watch in what had become Darkshire, grand hamlet renamed, worn down by decades of standing alone, was already stretched, simply managing the threats the darkness had brought. The curse spread through a landscape that had been stripped of the resources that might have slowed it. Whether that means the history of abandonment directly caused what Duskwood became, or only ensured that it became it faster and more completely. That is a distinction the records cannot fully resolve. What the records do show is that the two histories are inseparable. There is a name in the historical record of Duskwood that I return to whenever I want to understand what this particular pattern of loss costs at the scale of individual lives. The name is Stalvan Mistmantle. He was not a king or a general or a practitioner of great magic. He was originally from Silverpine Forest, traveled south through Stormwind, and eventually became the headmaster at the Moonbrook Schoolhouse in Westfall, also working as a personal tutor for the Flintridge family. He was educated, literate, unremarkable in most respects, and he developed an obsession with one of his students, a young woman named Tiloa, that crossed from infatuation into something far more dangerous. Tiloa never returned his feelings. She gave him a begonia once, a small kindness that Stalvan, in the particular disorder of his thinking, interpreted as a romantic overture. When she appeared before him with a young man whose hand she was holding, when she referred to Stalvan, casually and honestly, as an old uncle, something in him broke. He killed her. He killed her young groom-to-be. The accounts that survive call what followed a massacre. He then carefully hid the bodies, retreated to his home northeast of Darkshire, and remained there, alone, until the darkness crept into Duskwood and consumed him. He resides now in Manor Mistmantle, undead, mad, and still dangerous. The recovery of Stalvan's story required investigators who were willing to treat the specific tragedy of a specific place as worth understanding on its own terms. The quest that adventurers later undertook to uncover this history, gathering diary pages across multiple towns, tracing Stalvan's movements through documents preserved in Goldshire, Stormwind, and South Shore, working their way through the breadcrumb trail of a life until the full shape of it became visible, was doing something that the official historical apparatus had never done, assembling the fragments of a life and its ruin into something coherent enough to act on. Madame Eva, a seer in Darkshire, sensed that a young woman named Alyssa was in danger and set the investigation in motion. Without her, the accumulated evidence might have continued to sit in scattered archives indefinitely, each piece too small to mean anything in isolation. What makes Stalvan's case instructive is not the crime itself, which in the broader scope of Duskwood's catastrophes is a relatively contained event. What makes it instructive is the mechanism by which the investigation had to be conducted. The murders were not documented at the time in any way that produced a lasting record. Whatever response Darkshire's authorities mounted was not sufficient to account for what had happened, name what had happened, or create the kind of formal record that allows a community to recognize something as resolved. The survivors carried the knowledge quietly, in fragments, without expectation that anyone would ever come to ask. Stalvan's undead form still walks near his manor. This is easy to read as simply one more element of local horror, one more undead among the many, in a region defined by the undead. But if the mechanism is Morbent Fel's influence, it suggests something specific. Even within a necromancer's domain, the particular persistence of Stalvan's presence reflects the particular way his history accumulated in the region without resolution. The crimes were never answered by any consequence the community could collectively witness and name as sufficient. The story existed in fragments for years, each fragment carrying part of the truth, none of them enough to form a complete account. This pattern, specific harm, inadequate documentation, history that exists in pieces rather than as a whole, is the pattern of Duskwood in miniature. Stalvan's victims were named people whose lives were interrupted by specific, deliberate violence. In the absence of documentation, their fate was absorbed into the general description of Duskwood as a dangerous place, added to the aggregate horror without any of the particular detail that would have made it legible as the story of specific human beings. The Ravenhill Cemetery extends this principle to a collective scale. The graves there are not ancient. They are not remnants of civilizations that fell in the War of the Ancients or the Sundering. They are relatively recent, filled across a period of decades with people who lived and died in Duskwood during and after the First War, through the darkness that followed, through the years of accumulated loss. People who should, in a functioning relationship between a community and its history, be mourned and remembered. People who should have stories attached to their names. Ravenhill was one of the two sizable towns that Brightwood had held at its height, a real settlement with a real civic life, not simply a grave site. The cemetery existed to serve the living community of that town. Instead, cut off from the living community that might have protected it, it became the resource of a necromancer. Bodies were even sold to Morbent Fel from the Stormwind stockades by a criminal named Dextrin Ward, an arrangement that, when it came to light, said everything about how far Ravenhill had fallen from any condition the people buried there would have recognized as acceptable. The transformation from mourned dead to weaponized dead is itself a historical event, one that happens gradually in the accumulation of small failures of attention and care, until what should have been a place of memory becomes a place of threat. That transformation does not happen to cemeteries that are tended by living communities with the means and stability to tend them. It happens to cemeteries that have been left behind. The candle beside me has burned considerably lower than I intended, and outside this archive window, Dalaran settles into its late-night quiet. I find it difficult to set these accounts aside before they are properly recorded. There is something about the contrast. This city, preserved and floating above its own history, insulated by power and institutional attention, that makes the story of Duskwood feel more urgent, not less. Darkshire is the settlement at the center of Duskwood's surviving community, and it is one of the more remarkable places on Azeroth if you understand what it has endured. Grand Hamlet was what it was called before the darkness, one of two sizable towns in what was then Brightwood. It was renamed at some point in the long deterioration as Darkshire, a name that acknowledges the reality rather than pretending to an earlier identity. The people who live there are not people who wandered in and failed to find the exit. They are people who stayed through everything, or whose predecessors stayed, because they understood at some level that if they left, there would be no one left to hold the place. The Night Watch is Darkshire's militia, and the name earns its weight in a way that most civil defense forces do not. It was formed explicitly in response to the absence of external military support, a direct recognition that the Alliance's forces would not be deployed in numbers sufficient to protect the region, and that if Darkshire was going to be defended, it would be defended by the people who lived there. Commander Althea Ebenlock led it, and the manner in which the Watch understood its mission was notable for what was absent. No expectation of rescue, no appeal to distant authority, no illusion about the nature of the situation. There was a clear assessment of the threats, the resources, and the political reality, and a determination to manage it. That is not nobility in the romantic sense. Nobility implies a choice made from a position of security. What the Night Watch represents is something more specific and more costly, the choice to continue maintaining a place that no external force is maintaining, not because it is rewarded, but because the alternative is to abandon the last functioning community in a territory that has already been abandoned too many times. The patrols walk Duskwood's roads at night in full knowledge of what they might encounter: the Worgen in the western woods, the undead pressing outward from the cemetery, the dark riders that have been seen moving through the region on purposes no one in Darkshire has ever fully understood. They do it with insufficient personnel and equipment, in a settlement that reflects, in its material modesty, decades of receiving the minimum that political visibility requires, rather than the maximum that the situation demands. The Stormwind government has not entirely abandoned Darkshire. There are official acknowledgments, occasional supply shipments, the eventual provision of an artifact to counteract Morbent Fel's influence over the cemetery. The adventurers who pass through, drawn by the roads that connect the southern eastern kingdoms, contribute meaningfully, even if their contributions are temporary by nature. But the record of support across the decades shows something consistent. The response to Duskwood's needs has always been reactive, always insufficient, always calibrated to the minimum that prevents complete collapse, rather than the investment that might allow recovery. The settlement is too small, too peripheral, too long accustomed to managing its own survival, to generate the political pressure that produces genuine change in a kingdom with many competing demands. The physical infrastructure of the region surrounding Darkshire holds the evidence of what was there before. The abandoned farmsteads to the east and west. Roland's Doom in the western forest, originally a mine, now associated with the death of Velinde Starsong and the loss of the Scythe. The rotting orchard in the north, whose name and structure both preserve the memory of agricultural investment. Someone planted those trees, tended them over years, expected to harvest from them. The Worgen farmstead, where Sven Worgen has lived in proximity to the darkness longer than most, holding to land that the rest of the world has largely forgotten anyone claimed. The remnants of the road network that once connected these places to each other and to the larger world. All of it is still there. None of it is functioning as it was built to function. The Twilight Grove in Duskwood's interior represents a different layer entirely. One of the great trees, branches cut from Yggdrasil itself, 4,500 years before the Dark Portal, during the troubled period of Fandral Staghelm's attempt to heal Yggdrasil, took root in this region, acting as a conduit, channeling the powers of the Emerald Dream into the waking world. The Twilight Grove sits within that tree's influence, and the twilight there has a different quality from the rest of Duskwood. Not the fell darkness of Karazhan's shadow, but the dream-touched quietness of a place half in and half out of the world. The portal to the Emerald Dream that it holds has drawn druids who sleep there, and the Nightbane Worgen who feel the dream's pull. And during the third invasion of the Burning Legion, it drew the Dark Riders as well, who came seeking the Scythe of Elune and killed Valorn Stillball in the attempt. Duskwood is, in this sense, a place where multiple orders of catastrophe overlap without canceling each other out. Each one left its mark on the landscape and on the living community that has persisted within it. There is a principle that the more experienced researchers I worked with in the Explorers League held to with something approaching conviction. The absence of records is itself a record. When you arrive at a site and find that the historical evidence stops, that inscriptions end mid-sentence, that the settlement layers become suddenly sparse, that the material culture of a population disappears from the archaeological sequence without the gradual transition that marks voluntary departure, you are looking at evidence of something. The silence is informative. Duskwood fails the continuity test in almost every respect. The records from before the First War are sparse in the way that records of agricultural peripheries tend to be. The records of the evacuation period are fragmentary, filtered through the perspective of survivors who had already moved north. The records of the decades between the Second and Third Wars, the long, quiet years when the region was settling into its current shape, when the darkness was consolidating and the population was dwindling, are almost entirely absent. What should be there in a properly maintained historical archive is a continuous thread connecting the Brightwood that once existed to the Duskwood that exists now. What is actually there is a series of gaps, each one corresponding to a period when the region was undergoing something that no one with the means to document it was present to observe. The long gap between the Second War and the Third is the most significant of these silences. Those are the years when the darkness became normal, When the people who remembered Brightwood died and were replaced by people for whom the perpetual shadow was simply the condition of the world they had been born into. When something becomes normal, the imperative to explain it diminishes. And once the explanation stops being passed down, the tragedy it describes loses its specific shape and becomes simply the way things are. Most of what Brightwood lost was never written down. It was carried in the memories of people who eventually died, many of them without passing those memories on in any form that has survived. The specific character of specific communities, the names of the families who farmed the land near the rotting orchard, the shape of ordinary life in Grand Hamlet before it became Darkshire, the expectations of people who had no particular reason to believe their world was about to end, is gone in the documentary sense. It survives, if it survives anywhere, in the landscape itself. I have walked the roads of Duskwood several times over my years with the Explorers League, and I have tried to read that landscape with the same attention I would give to any archive. The abandoned farmsteads speak, in their architecture and their deterioration, to a period of construction and a period of abandonment. And the gap between those two periods is legible in the physical evidence if you know how to interpret it. The stone foundations are not ancient. They are not the foundations of some pre-sundering civilization. They are the foundations of houses built by people who lived in what we would recognize as the historical present, who used the same materials and techniques as people build with across the Eastern kingdoms today. The domestic spaces where they can still be entered would be familiar to any resident of Goldshire or Lakeshire. Hearths in the same positions, door frames at the same height, the same kind of modest arrangement of space that suggests people who were building for permanence, not for show. The distance between those abandoned lives and the present is not vast in historical terms. It only feels vast because nothing bridged it. This is not unusual in Azerothian history. The repeated catastrophes that have marked the world's recent centuries have produced this kind of documentary silence again and again. What makes Duskwood instructive is the way the silences are layered. The silence of the First War evacuation, the silence of the abandonment that followed the Second War, the silence around Medivh's death and the darkness it produced, the silence around the Worgen crisis and what it did to whatever population remained. Each silence was produced by a different catastrophe, and each one made the next catastrophe harder to record and harder to respond to. The connection between those failures and the physical state of the region today is, I think, closer than the official histories acknowledge. Morbent Fel could raise the dead of Ravenhill precisely because those dead were inadequately protected, because the community that should have maintained the cemetery had been reduced to the point where maintenance was difficult, and because the larger institutional response to Duskwood's needs had never been proportional to the need. The Worgen curse could spread as thoroughly as it did precisely because there were so few people left to resist it and so little external support to augment whatever resistance was mounted. The darkness from Karazhan fell on a region that had already been emptied and continued to be neglected. Whether you read all of that as the consequence of deliberate political choice or of the inevitable priorities of kingdoms managing larger crises, or of simple inattention compounding over time, the effect on the ground is the same. The layers of damage accumulated, and they have not been undone. The question I opened with asked what happens when the dead refuse to stay in the past. I have spent this entire chronicle working toward the realization that the framing is backwards, and that the reversal matters more than the question itself. The dead of Duskwood are not refusing anything. They are not exercising agency in remaining. The undead of Raven Hill are, in the most literal sense, the product of a necromancer's craft, raised by Morbent Fel and directed by his purposes. The Worgen that walk the forest trace to catastrophes initiated far from Duskwood, by a Gilnean archmage who was desperate, and a scholar who studied something he never tried to use, and by a night elf priestess who came to the region looking for help and did not survive to find it. The darkness in the sky is the residue of a guardian's corruption, a mage's death, and the release of decades of accumulated fel energy, none of which Duskwood caused or deserved. What these things share is that none of them were ever fully addressed. The darkness was not remediated. The necromancer was defeated, returned as a lich. Defeated again, his influence suppressed by an artifact rather than permanently ended. The Worgen have been managed, pushed back, studied, but the conditions that brought them here have not been reversed. Each of these threads suggests the same thing: management of symptoms rather than treatment of causes. This is not a failure of the Night Watch, which does extraordinary work with the resources available to it. It is a structural feature of how the rest of the world relates to Duskwood, as a problem to be contained at acceptable cost rather than a place to be healed at whatever cost that requires. The people who lived in Brightwood before the darkness were not party to any of the great choices that undid their home. They were not present at Karazhan when Medivh's corruption was sealed. They had no voice in the Council of Tirisfal. They did not summon the Horde through the dark portal. They were, as far as the available records can determine, simply people who lived in a place that happened to be in the path of consequences generated by forces beyond any human community's capacity to anticipate or prevent. Medivh's death released the darkness. The failure to support Brightwood's survivors allowed the damage to compound. Arugal's summoning, Greymane's command, Ur's inadvertent contribution, those spread the Worgen curse into territory already unable to resist it. Velinde Starsong's death in Roland's Doom left the Scythe where any hand might find it. Morbent Fel found in Raven Hill a cemetery full of people who had died across decades of accumulated crisis, and he made of them what necromancers make of the unattended dead. None of it was inevitable. Brightwood, in a world where the Alliance had invested in its recovery after the Second War, or where any of the subsequent catastrophes had been addressed with the seriousness they warranted, that Brightwood might still exist. It might still have the two sizable towns the old maps record. The graves in Raven Hill might be tended. The rotting orchard might still produce fruit that someone harvests. That world did not happen. The world that did happen produced Duskwood. And Duskwood persists, not because the dead refuse to leave the past, but because the living world has never fully reckoned with what it did and failed to do for a place that had every right to expect more from the civilization it supported. The Night Watch represents the refusal to accept that failure as final. Commander Ebenlock and the people who have served under her are not performing heroism in any sense the chronicles usually use that word. They are doing ordinary work, day after day, in a place made extraordinarily difficult by the failures of larger forces over a longer period than any individual life can span. Their persistence is not romantic. It is the decision to continue, to maintain Darkshire as a living community, to keep the roads open, to insist by the fact of their continued presence that the territory has not been entirely surrendered to what was done to it. Darkshire's lanterns are lit every night by people who understand this at whatever level of awareness, and who choose to light them anyway. That is not a small thing. In a region where the darkness is this old and this deep, maintaining a light at all is a form of argument, an insistence that the place and its history matter, that what was lost here deserves to be acknowledged, and that the accounting, however long deferred, is not yet impossible. The records compiled here are incomplete, as all records of Duskwood must be. The darkness that fell from Karazhan cannot be undocumented into a different past. The Worgen cannot be talked into returning to the Emerald Dream. The graves in Raven Hill cannot be untouched by the hands that disturb them. But the archive has not closed, and somewhere in the darkness between the Night Watch's patrol routes, the evidence of what this place once was is still legible, in abandoned foundations and overgrown orchards, and the names the old maps still carry for places where no one now lives. It waits, as old evidence waits, for the attention that would make it coherent and the honesty that would make it useful. Compiled from expedition notes, Stormwind historical vaults, recovered personal accounts, and direct observation during 4 documented visits to the Duskwood region, including extended stays in Darkshire and the Raven Hill area. These findings are preserved in the holdings of the Azeroth archives for the record.